Begin transmission. It's been 2 days since we landed on this planet, and those 2 days have been filled with many new discoveries, many more than I could ever relay in a single transmission. But we've been working very diligently on describing our annelids. And in the past 2 days, we have discovered, described, and documented 15,000 species on this planet so far. In marine environments and terrestrial environments, living underground, in the ocean, on the ocean floor. They are abundant on this planet, among some of the most abundant and diverse groups on this whole planet, as far as we can tell. Of course, I could never have done this all alone. Our head taxonomist, as you know, is extremely good at what he does, and he's my son, Charlie. Charlie is a next-generation model, as you could say, extremely advanced intelligence. He is also the youngest member of the crew, and he described 11,000 of these worms all by himself just yesterday. Here is his picture, his official ID picture, and I think this reveals a lot about who Charlie is. He has a sweetheart. I love him dearly, but his intelligence makes him leaning a little bit towards arrogance, and which is understandable because he is smarter than every other member of the crew combined. So he is supremely confident in his own abilities, and that makes him good at what he does, but I think it makes a little bit of the crew a little uncomfortable. But I am definitely glad to have him with me, and both as a son and as a colleague. So I couldn't have described all these worms without him, so thank you for sending him with me. Now, what we decided to do, so we can't send all 15,000 species described back to you. We've selected 12 of them that we think represent the Annelida as a phylum, as a whole. And these are the 12 you should learn. You should know their classification, their anatomy, their physiology, some behavior about them. And if you know this, then you can infer from that the biology of annelids in general. Before we get started on the annelids, though, I have one very interesting update for you. We have made a tube that channels the fresh water from the spring directly through our habitats to bring drinking water right through where we live and to remove wastes, but it was being clogged by something. So we've only been here a few days, so we thought maybe some leaves or tree branches had gotten stuck in there. So we sent out a little remote-controlled probe into the tunnel we made, and we saw these two mysterious lumps in there. Now, all that should be in here is water and the interior of the tube, but when the probe got closer and shone a light on the mass on the side of the wall, it actually moves. It contracts. What is that? Remarkably disturbing. It seems to be some kind of alien life form. I've never seen anything like this before in my life. The remote operator was quite visibly disturbed and shaken, and he ran to me and said, "What is this?" And so I've taken a look at this, and what we can see is there's a central blob of some kind of writhing mass. We don't know if it, initially we didn't know if it was an egg mass or some type of alien creature oozing along the sides. Here's a smaller mass, and you can see the tendrils contract whenever we shine a light on it. What could this possibly be? Of course, some of us, some of the crew, notably Dave, was a little bit worried that these creatures were crawling in through the tunnels and were going to crawl up through our toilets and slurp our kidneys out. Dave doesn't know much about biology, but I just think that's highly unlikely. They don't seem to be the type of creatures that would like to eat kidneys whole, but we don't know what kind of life forms are on this planet. So we sent out another probe with a sampling attachment, and we got a little sample of this blob, and when we look at it under a microscope, it's actually not a single organism. It's actually a complex community of very small annelids. These annelids are tubifex worms, these creatures right here. These tubifex worms are usually solitary or aggregate in general. I've discovered them on the edges of ponds, kind of embedded in the murky mud along the sides. And what's interesting about them, they make little casing, little tubes, kind of like the fan worms do, but they don't have tentacles to capture the food. Instead, they are anoxic feeders. They can generate their own energy through anaerobic metabolism. They don't require energy. They don't require oxygen to survive. So they can live in a deep, muddy slurries of sediment where almost nothing else can live. And for some reason, they infiltrate our little drinking tube, and because there wasn't any sediment around, they just aggregated around themselves. What's fascinating is that when they aggregate around themselves, it seems that they kind of take on the characteristics of a larger organism. So when you poke one or you shine a light on one, it contracts, and the other worms can sense that contraction from even across the writhing mass of worms, and they all contract in almost what appears to be unison. And so these single individual, very small, usually they're less than the size of a centimeter, when they aggregate in these large clumps, they take on characteristics, emergent properties that are more than the sum of their parts. So these are tubifex worms. They're in phylum Annelida, class Sedentaria, order Clitellata. The most famous of the members of order Clitellata are the soil worms that our botanist is very excited about. They seem to be performing a very valuable ecosystem role in recycling nutrients underground. These worms we're calling lumbricus. Lumbricus soil worms they look smooth, but they still have the paired epidermal setae and the obvious metameric body segments that groups them within annelids. And you can see a very obvious clitellum. This is going to be the unique feature of this order. And as you already know, this clitellum secretes a mucus cocoon during reproduction, helps adhere the worms together, and then encases the fertilized embryos in a nice little cocoon for development. These soil worms are extremely valuable ecosystem engineers. We've sampled soil with them and without them, and it seems that their presence actually changes the composition, the plant composition, what trees can grow, the soil acidity, and the nutrients in the soil. So these soil worms are incredibly valuable members of this community. A slightly more malevolent member of order Clitellata is Hirudo, the leech. And these leeches, like I said, they have segments, but they don't have internal divisions within those segments, so they're missing their septa. So instead they have this hollow muscular body with which they fill with the blood of other creatures. They have these dorsal plates that they use to slice open flesh, and then they secrete a very potent anticoagulant protein that makes vertebrate blood just run without clotting at all. So I think this can be a very valuable have very valuable medicinal properties if we can study it more. There is a lot of use for blood thinning medication, and so if we could borrow this protein, figure out how it works, and then synthesize it and make it safe for humans, we could solve a lot of blood clotting disorders. So this is a very important medicinal animal, and for benevolent purposes, maybe it will help us with blood clotting disorders, but malevolently, it's something that we need to be careful of when we're trouncing through the forest, and always check for leeches. As far as we know, they don't transmit any bacteria or diseases, but they can cause quite a bit of pain and a little mental discomfort if you find a bunch on your leg. So this is Hirudo, the medicinal leech, still within phylum Annelida, class Sedentaria, order Clitellata. Going back to the marine environment, in the marine environment, the sedentarians have a really diverse array of capturing food. So we talked about ciliary feeders, and our representative for this is Sabella, the fan worm. So Sabella is a fan worm, ciliary feeder. It creates a nice little parchment tube, reminiscent of tubifex that it lives in, but these guys have a nice ciliated crown of tentacles that they use to filter the water for organic particles. On each of their radials, they have pinnules that stick out. This is just to maximize surface area, so they give a higher chance of actually capturing floating organic particles in the water. Then they have little cilia on their troughs that they ferry the food to their mouths where they eat it. They're also very sensitive to vibrations in the water and light. I could pass my hand over them and they'll retract their tentacles into their protective tube really rapidly. So they have a good sensory system, good nervous system, and but they spend most of their day sedentarily feeding, filtering the water for nutrients. Amphitrite is a deposit feeder, and these took us a while to find. We spent most of the day in the marine environment, and we didn't know we had thousands of these under our feet. But they embed themselves into the benthic environment, so their bodies are underground, and then their tentacles spread along the surface, and then they catch anything that's falling down. And then again, the cilia ferry the food to their mouths. So class Sedentaria, the genus is Amphitrite. Amphitrite is a deposit feeder. Lugworms are found wherever there's beaches. These are, as you can kind of see from this picture, they're kind of the earthworms of the sea. They're not terrestrial, and you can see the little nubs there are remnants of the parapodia. The parapodia, if you remember, have a neuropodia and a notopodium part. The notopodium is filled with an intense array of respiratory capillaries, and you can see here that most of the fleshy projections of the parapodia have atrophied, have been lost over evolutionary time, and what's left is the neuropodia of respiratory capillaries. So these are essentially function as pure gills in Arenicola, the lugworm. They build a nice little burrow underground and then pump water through it. The water is filtered by the sand, and so the sand catches all the nice little bacteria and organic nutrients they need, and then they eat the sand and then expel the sand out the back, leaving these intricate casings of eaten sand behind. So it's very distinctive. If you're ever wandering down a beach and you see little kind of casings of worm-like soil, then probably underneath there is a lugworm enjoying his little life. One unusual member of class Sedentaria, these actually belong to their own unique family, the sipunculans. These are beard worms or thread worms, and they are found wherever there's giant skeletons in the ocean. So they might be more plentiful in other places, but the place we found them most commonly is feasting on these giant bones of some monstrous creature. I'm not sure what it is. But they embed their heads into the bone. So these bone eater worms we're calling osidax. So these bone eaters, osidax, they embed their heads into the bone, and then they have to rely on a mutualistic bacteria to help them turn that bone into energy that they can actually use to grow and develop. These long thread-like things on the back are for respiration, so they have an extremely long kind of tail, thread-like tail, so that's why they're called threadworms. Another unique family within class Sedentaria are the echidurids, the spoonworms. They're called spoonworms because they have a nice spoon-like proboscis that they use to capture food as it settles to the bottom of the seafloor. So they're usually benthic marine animals, and they have a large elongate body that they usually bury in the soil, and then their proboscis lays out outside their little burrow and catches food and then retracts or filters or funnels through cilia into their mouth. Benelia is the green spoonworm, and Benelia is a fascinating creature. So we noticed that a lot of the area around the spoonworm, there was little to no life. Not even bacteria seem to be able to get close to Benelia. And it turns out that Benelia is secreting a really unique protein. We're calling it benelin, and benelin is a biocidal protein. It kills almost everything we've put it in contact with, bacteria, some viruses. It affects other cells of flatworms and worms and other life. So this biocidal protein, I think, is going to be really important. If we get sick, if we run out of antibiotics, maybe we can synthesize something that will be effective using benelin as a source. So these Benelia worms, green spoonworms, secrete benelin, which is a really potent biocide. Also, their reproductive system is fairly strange. They do something called environmental sex determination. So the sex of the worms is not determined genetically. It's actually determined by where they live in the environment. The female worm, as pictured here, this is a female worm. She secretes a hormone, and when all the little larvae are released from her body, wherever they land, that determines whether they're going to be male or female. If a larva lands on her body or very near her body within this circle of hormone concentration, then they will develop into males. The males will maintain a very, very small size, and most of them will actually be slurped up by the female, and then she holds them all in a little pouch inside her body. And all they do is live there, produce sperm, so they almost become one organism. Very unusual. So to become a female, the larva has to land outside this concentration, this hormone concentration threshold, far from its mother. If it lands far away, then it becomes a female and can develop into a large adult worm. So what happens is you have little territories that are environmentally determined, where you have a female here and all the males with her, and you have a female here and all the males with her. So very, very interesting. So the actual sex is determined by hormone concentrations, and that is determined by how close to the mother they land after they're born. In contrast to class Sedentaria, the Aurantian worms are free-living, primarily marine, and as far as we know, very few of them filter feed. They don't have those specialized feeding. Most of them are predatory and mobile benthic or pelagic predators. One representative that is a very good anatomical model for all of Annelida as a whole is Nereus, the clam worm. The clam worm is found abundantly on beaches, and we can fill a bucket of it. We can fill up a bucket with Nereus worms in about a morning, and then we can use those worms to fish for other animals. They seem to be, almost all animals seem to like to eat these. I tried a few, and they're moderately tasty. If I was a marine animal, I would probably eat a whole bunch. But you can see the parapody on the side. We can see the elongate setae on the side. We can see the obvious segmentation, and we can even see the tentacles and the versible pharynx on these creatures. So these are a great model, anatomical and physiological model for all of phylum Annelida as a whole. And this is Nereus, the clamworm of class Aurantia. Another important member of class Aurantia is Eunice. Eunice is the bobbit worm, and Eunice is a ambush benthic predator, and so it buries its whole body into the soil, similar to Amphitrite, the deposit feeder, but instead of tentacles around, it has these jaws that have a mechanism where they will lock into place, so they're not expending energy in maintaining them being open, and then they can snap shut with incredible speed. One of the fastest things we've seen on this planet is the closing of the jaws of the bobbit worm, of Eunice. They will eat anything, other worms, other vertebrates. We've tested them on a lot of different animals, and they seem to just prefer whatever is in the area. Once they grab it, they pull it into their lair where they will consume it. Sometimes it takes several days, and they don't have to eat except every few months. So this is like kind of a classic low energy ambush predator, where it sits in one place, expends lots of energy at a moment in time to get a large meal of food, and then it doesn't have to eat for quite a while after that. So this is Eunice, the bobbit worm, another member of class Aurantia. Now this is a strange creature. I mentioned this when we were floating about in the deep sea, and we turned off our lights and we started seeing bioluminescent creatures. Well, one of those bioluminescent creatures is this creature right here. It's fairly small, only a few centimeters long, and it seems to have segments, and when we took these back to our lab, it seems genetically to align with a lot of the Annelida worms. But it's not really similar to the Aurantians or the Sedentarians, so we don't feel comfortable putting in its own class for now. So this worm, the flying buttocks, as Charlie likes to call it, this is in phylum Annelida, but it's without a class. The genus name is Chaetopterus, and Chaetopterus is a pelagic marine filter feeder. It's just going to feed off the detritus, the marine snow that's kind of filtering down from the upper levels of the ocean. So this is kind of a disembodied butt floating around in the ocean, collecting food as it can. Very strange animal, but it seems to share an affinity with other worms. It has setae and it has segments, and genetically it seems to belong to phylum Annelida. But as of yet, it's not placed to any specific class. The last organism you should become familiar with is sipunculus, the fat innkeeper. This is a worm-like creature. It's not an actual worm, it's in a new phylum, so it's in phylum Sipuncula, not phylum Annelida, and that's because even though it looks very similar to a worm, it doesn't have segments, doesn't have internal body segments, and it doesn't have paired epidermal setae. So it's similar, but it's not similar enough to group it in the same phylum. So we place it in its own phylum, phylum Sipuncula. It's actually quite similar to amphitrite, where it buries most of its body underground, and then it has a little tentacular crown with which it filters food. If that little tentacular crown is called an introvert, because it can be introverted back into its head and then extroverted back out. So the introvert is a synapomorphy of phylum Sipuncula. Sipunculus, as I mentioned, is called the fat innkeeper. I think it's a rather clever name because the fat innkeeper, he's a little chubby, and he makes a little burrow, and inside this burrow he has all kinds of commensal organisms. So we don't even know what all these species are yet, but there are some other worms there. There are some very crunchy guys with lots of legs. There are some worm-like creatures that aren't quite worms. We don't know, but so far we've discovered 13 different species using the little inn of this little fat innkeeper. So he's a habitat creator, and I don't know if they're getting protection from him or if they're benefiting him in some way. But as far as we know, he just kind of creates a burrow that other animals can then live in as well. So this is the fat innkeeper. Genus Sipunculus, phylum Sipuncula. And that is the 12 organisms we need to know from phylum Annelida, know their synapomorphies, know their classification, and become very familiar with what they look like and their unique synapomorphies. Because very soon you will have to tell me what you know about them in transmission.